Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey all, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is a guest expert interview with Phyllis Fagell, and she is a licensed therapist and middle school counselor. And she has written a couple of books about middle schoolers. And today I got to pick her brain about how we as parents can support our middle school kids. So if you've got a tween or a young teen, this is going to be an episode that you will want to check out, or put some of these ideas in your back pocket for later if your child is younger. We talked about how to help kids have more self-confidence and a greater sense of self-esteem, how to coach them through troubles that they're having, friend troubles, what to do if they are being bullied, and really just how to support our kid in this really topsy-turvy age of that, that tween and young teen age. And I kept saying to Phyllis, I'm having trauma flashbacks because this age, it can be so hard. And also this age group is also so wonderful. And it is such a transition point, such an important transition point. Phyllis calls it our last best chance. So join me in welcoming Phyllis Fagell to the podcast. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And if you did, be sure to share it with a friend who has a middle school kiddo or somebody who's about to have a kid who's entering that age. And definitely check out Phyllis's books. They are really wonderful. We've got lots of links for you in the show notes to check out. So let's meet Phyllis. Hi, Phyllis. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I loved your book. I just read it over the weekend. Your book, now I'm not going to get the title right. We just talked about the superpowers of middle schoolers. What's the title exactly?
Middle school superpowers.
Middle school superpowers.
Resilient tweens in turbulent times. Yep.
Oh, it was really good. Before we get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am a licensed therapist. So I see kids and teens in private practice. I also work in a school. I have been a school counselor for a long time. I'm currently in an all-boys school, which is a big change from the co-ed school I was at for the last 8 years. And I have 3 kids and write a lot about kids and well-being, education, and counseling.
What do you consider the ages of middle school?
Younger probably than people might expect. I really would start this phase at around 9 or 10 years old, especially as kids are going through puberty earlier. And while when I wrote my first book, I said it ended around age 14, post-pandemic, I would actually say about 15, since kids' skills are lagging just a little bit behind.
So tween and early teen sort of age
Exactly.
we're talking about.
Exactly. Late young childhood, early adolescence.
Give us some typical characteristics of what you see in this age group. I think kids really in those years, it almost is like an imprint of which way your life is going to go, your experience in this age group. So maybe just give us a little description of sort of what you see as the characteristics and strengths and challenges of this age group.
Well, first, I love the way you just characterized it. It's why I always call it the last best chance, because the stakes are so low when you make mistakes, but it's such an opportunity to really imprint values and teach kids how to stay organized and how to make friends and how to recover when things don't go the way they had hoped they would go. So there is a ton of opportunity for parents to jump in and coach. I think what's challenging is that they don't seem at all like that younger child that might have come home and just babbled on and on about their day. Suddenly they're more private and they might not be as forthcoming. They might be more reluctant to share something if they think that it might be met with criticism or judgment. And yet at the same time, they care so much what their parents think. They care so much what their teachers think. And I consider them the perfect mix of wide-eyed innocence and sophistication. They're old enough to really absorb what it is we want to teach them and to understand sophisticated ideas, but they're still young enough that they're not jaded, they're not cynical, and they haven't yet really pulled away to be with their peers and care more about their peers and what their parents think. that's beginning in this age group.
And in your book, you say they're sometimes 13 going on 3 or 13 going on 30. I think that's like a
Depending on the
perfect.
hour.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a perfect description of them. Are there any particular challenges that you see? I mean, well, I don't want to totally like make this about a gender binary, but are there particular challenges you see in this age group that boys face or girls face particularly?
Yeah, I think it's challenging to talk about this because the research that's been done is so binary. So, and obviously we're generalizing, there are exceptions to everything. But when you look at the research on boys versus girls, boys tend to be more preoccupied with dominance and competition. They're subjected to stereotypes about masculinity related to things like being stoic or appearing uncaring. They are much less conflict averse than girls. Girls are much less likely to take a risk or express unhappiness in a relationship if they think it might disappoint somebody or they might step on someone else's toes. Let's say they want to run for student council and so does their best friend. They might not do it. Girls are much more likely to hang out in smaller groups. They care so much about those intimate relationships, whereas boys are traveling in bigger packs, which means they have different challenges. Boys are very much interested in having trusting relationships, but it's harder for them to achieve that. It's harder for them to ask for help. And on the flip side, girls need to be reminded that it is okay to speak their mind, to set boundaries, to tell that friend that they don't want to have the 14th sleepover in 4 months. They also want to hang out with someone else. Those things are really hard for girls to do.
It's so interesting. I'm almost getting a little bit of like PTSD flashbacks when you're talking about this. It's such a hard time. I know it was when I was a kid, and then having watched all 3 of my kids go through those middle school years, it's such a hard time with, as you said, kids are moving away from their parents, but their parents are still important. And one thing I really noticed about this age is that kids are putting each other under a microscope. I remember my son once telling me that he couldn't wear these random socks that had the Air Jordan symbol on them. And why not? And he said, because when I'm changing in gym class, kids will look at that and say, you don't play basketball. You can't wear those socks. I was like, really? That just to me encapsulated that sort of being under a microscope of those middle school years. Why do you think that is?
It's a phase where kids desperately want to fit in, which is different than belonging. And it is harder to feel a sense of belonging than it is to just conform to whatever everyone else is doing or whatever those unwritten rules of socializing are. And your kid clearly has some emotional intelligence. He was able to anticipate what might go awry if he wore socks that signaled he played a sport that he doesn't, in fact, play. I mean, the funny thing is that he's thinking about it a lot more than other kids are thinking about him. They're so preoccupied and egotistical. It's just part of the phase. And it can also manifest. I've had a lot of parents, especially in the last 5 or 6 months, ask me why their kids are obsessed with these really expensive face cream or need to get their makeup at Sephora or why they have to carry around a Stanley Cup that costs a bajillion dollars. And they're worried their kids are materialistic or that they have no sense of money and that it says something about their values. And I always reassure them that it doesn't say anything at all about their values. And of course, you can set limits, but understand that it comes from that place of just wanting to fit in, of controlling what they can control. They can't control what makes somebody popular or not, but they can at least control if they're wearing the right sweatshirt or the right sneakers to a certain degree, at least.
Yeah, I saw that with all of my kids going through this pretty much 2-year phase of wanting to shop at certain stores. And it really wasn't in our family values. And I always share that with parents whenever they share what you just shared is they'll come back to your family values. This is just like a blip of confusing that fitting in with belonging and having to have this certain brand name stuff. I love that you brought up belonging versus fitting in. It's pretty hard to convince a 12-year-old that they're not the same thing. But how do you cultivate that sense of having them looking for belonging instead of the fitting in? Or do you? Or maybe you just let them go with the fitting in?
I think it's a mix of both. I think to a certain degree, we can accommodate that need to fit in, recognizing that it's developmentally appropriate. And we can really underscore how happiness comes from that sense of belonging, which means that you can be yourself when you're with your friends. You can be your goofy self or your serious self, whatever that might be. And unlike elementary school, when we're, as parents, making those play dates, we lose that control when they go to middle school. And also, even if we tried to convince them not to be friends with someone or tried to show them that they're probably going to get dropped by this group of friends that we can see that they are trying super hard to stay a part of, but aren't really being included. That's work that they have to do. Our role is to kind of flag it in an unobtrusive way. Maybe we say to them something like, how do you feel when you're with that particular friend? It seems like you're really on edge. Or I've noticed that when you're talking to them, when we're driving to some sports practice, it seems like you're trying to come up with really outlandish stories, like you feel like you need to impress them or make them laugh. And I've noticed you're different with this other friend. So I've wondered, are pretty low-key ways to signal that something might be worth examining, but they have to do that work. And we want them to do that work. As I said, it's the last best chance because this is when they need to figure out how to pick a friend, how to be a friend. And if we do that work for them, not only will we be unsuccessful, we're really going to deprive them of acquiring the skills they need to make good romantic choices later and choose good friends throughout life.
That really stood out to me in your book, that it's really all about coaching kids by asking them curious questions so that they can draw their own conclusions about what a friend makes you feel like or what you're looking for in a friend or how to be a good friend instead of telling, which I think is so hard. As our mutual friend Ned Johnson talks about, we're moving from manager to consultant, right? And the consultant is the asking those good questions so that they can draw their own conclusions. How else would you coach parents when their kids are having friendship troubles? Let's start with if your kid doesn't have friends, how would you coach them? That's such a painful thing.
I think I was talking to the psychologist, Mitch Prinstein, for an article not that long ago, and he was talking about how for about the last 25 years or so, we had this impression that suddenly when kids made the transition from elementary to middle, that we could no longer teach concrete social skills, that they were too old for that. And what we're realizing now is that kids continue to need that kind of practical support long into their teens. And that might mean that they need to help entering a conversation. It could mean that they don't know how to make plans for themselves and kind of seal the deal and figure out where they're going and when and how they're getting there. It could be that they are too much for one of their friends. I see this sometimes with kids who are neurodivergent, and the parents have heard over and over again that all kids need are one or two friends. And that's actually probably not the best strategy with a kid who is neurodivergent and struggling socially. That kid needs a ton of practice without turning anyone off completely. So for that child, you might be looking at having really structured hangouts, maybe bowling or decorating cookies that don't last too long with a wide variety of kids rather than overtaxing one particular friend. And for the kids who are struggling socially because they really want to be popular or they want to be part of a particular group and it's just not working out for them, we don't want to dismiss those feelings, always validate those feelings, and then help them think about it as a temporary issue that they're not with those friends, as opposed to being like, you're never going to be friends with those kids. It could be, let's help you figure out who are some right fit friends for right now so you're not lonely. And I always share with kids the research that social status isn't fixed, that people change, people can be nice later on, that you don't want to burn any bridges because that kid that you pulled away from in 7th grade might actually be somebody you want to be friends again with in 10th grade. And helping kids be kind and behave in a way that a future version of themselves will look back and be proud of that individual. But what I think we forget is how much support kids need in order to pull that off. So literally explaining that rather than tell someone that you don't want to be friends or telling 20 other people why you think that person is annoying, you can just decide you're not going to hang out with them out of school, but you'll be nice in school, or you might take a little longer to return their texts, and looking for those more benign, less hurtful ways of creating some space for yourself.
Where's the balance between coaching a kid in terms of social skills and also helping them feel like they're lovable the way they are? Because I think that can be hard too. Sometimes I think it just takes time for kids as they mature to find their people. And back to that question of fitting in and versus belonging, I could see how my daughter could have had more friends when she was that age if she had done certain things differently in terms of what she wore or the interests she was public about. But I very consciously shut my mouth because I didn't want her to feel like there was anything less than about who she really was. And she did end up in high school finding friends and has a good group of friends. But what do you think about that balance?
I think that reassuring kids that even if things aren't going well socially, it doesn't mean that it has anything to do with them. So I do share statistics with kids. There's so much social churn in those years. So many kids are maturing at different rates. Friendships are pulling apart. I even share the statistics that only about a third of friendships last from the beginning to the end of sixth grade, and only 1% of friendships make it from seventh to 12th grade. Only half of people, when they name their best friend in middle school, have that person name them back. And about 12% of sixth graders have no friends at all. And I don't share that to make them think that middle school is this dreadful, dire time in their life. It's really to reinforce the idea that every single kid is getting dumped by a friend at some point, and everybody is sort of sorting themselves out and figuring out where they fit. And that's hard work. And that's why people think about middle school and sometimes grown, because this is when that work is happening. And on the other side, a lot of good comes out of having done that work, including learning how to surround yourself with the kind of people that actually make you feel good. We as parents can't make our child feel good about themselves. And in fact, it can ring hollow if we say, "You're so cool. I can't believe they don't want to hang out with you." It's just not going to be believable. They have to see the proof that people want to be with them. So what we can do is make sure we're signing them up for activities where they're likely to meet kids who are similar to them. If they're a more serious techie kid, maybe they do robotics, or maybe they're in a Lego club or a maker space activity, but looking for something where they're not going to be surrounded by people they're unlikely to have things in common with. And then if there's that little bit of a spark, we can fan the flames on that. So when we pick them up, we can take them and a friend from that activity out for lunch. We can do something that helps them create that bond, that closer bond. And we can teach kids how to show curiosity and ask questions. I always think of Niobe Way, especially her work with boys on curiosity. And she talks about how we need to be helping kids actually take things to the next level. One of the funniest memories about my own kid, he was about 12 and he was at overnight camp, and we would get postcards that I think the camp made him send us. And the postcards would talk about his bunkmate, this kid who shared the bunk bed with him, and all the fun they were having. And we got one call over the course of the summer, and I asked him about the kid and who shared the bunk bed with him. And I said, "Who is he? What's his name?" And my son, who had been at camp for 3 weeks, goes, "I don't know."
Oh, that's so
And
funny.
I said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And he was like, "I don't know. We just play." And so teaching kids to ask questions, to ask a more probing question. If you ask a kid to come home and have 3 new pieces of information about a peer, you might find it startling that they actually know very, very little about their close friends, and you can almost give them an assignment. But teaching them how to bond and how to show interest in other people can help them create those bonds that they're looking for. And I always say with middle schoolers in particular, since they're so insecure, if you can teach them how to give an authentic compliment that would be meaningful to someone, that will take them very, very far.
But I think that's one of the points in that 100-year-old book, How to Make Friends and Influence People, is asking them questions about themselves. So it's definitely a tried and true way to make friends.
Yes. And I think middle schoolers tend to think the way to make friends is to impress them, to talk about everything they do well and to have the right clothes and project the right image. And we need to really be intentional about teaching them that the way to connect with someone actually is about getting outside of yourself and finding something about them that you can comment on or notice or ask them further questions about.
One thing I really liked about your book was that you really coach parents to lead with curiosity when your middle schooler does something that seems unkind or unwise or whatever. It really struck me how much they're still, even though they look so mature, they're still learning. And you had that one anecdote about the kids who overheard a friend say something bad about the other person, and you asked them all, should you tell the friend? Maybe you could just tell that story and how you dealt with it, because I think we would all jump to conclusions about middle schoolers' intent, but that's such a mistake.
Yeah. And I think it's easy for us to see their behavior through adult eyes. It's been a while since we were in their shoes. And when you pause and ask them why they did something or why they made a choice rather than leaping to our own judgment and assumptions, you actually not only give them a runway back to problem solving with you and maybe making something right that was hurtful to someone else, but it allows them to feel like you're treating them like the expert in their own life. We're not constantly lecturing them and assuming we know best. So that story that you were referencing, it started with a phone call from a mother who is really upset because her daughter's good friend, a really close friend, had sent her a video of two other girls who they both knew, who she had overheard trash talking her daughter. And her mother could not for the life of her understand why her good friend would send her this hurtful video. And I actually shared the anecdote with an entire class of sixth graders. And I didn't betray any of my own opinions. I just asked them, I told them the scenario. I said, you're somewhere in public, you hear two girls you know trash talking a really close friend of yours, and you are upset for your friend. Would you try to record them? If you did, would you send it to your friend? And almost all the sixth graders said yes to both. And I said, tell me why. And they said, well, you should be loyal to your close friend. She should know who she could trust. She should know that this person these two kids who they thought were her good friend are not such good friends. And so then I asked them a whole lot of questions, just as you were referencing, things like, have you ever said something negative about somebody? How would you feel if somebody recorded you and sent it to them? Have you ever said it just to fit in or in a moment when you were annoyed, but you didn't really mean it in any kind of serious way? If you hear it, is there anything you can do with that information? Can you unhear it? And by the time we were done talking about it and really thinking about it in a more analytical way, they all changed their minds and decided they would not record and they would not send it to their friend. And yeah, I think that really underscores how much coaching they need, as opposed to us going in, guns a-blazing to shame them for behavior that they truly thought was the right thing to do.
They really do want to do the right thing. They just are not as mature as sometimes we give them credit for.
And they have no life experience, perspective, and they're going through puberty. So every emotion is like 110 on a scale of 1 to 10. And they have a lot of, I call it emotional interference in the book, things like jealousy, competition, anger, that can get in the way of doing the right thing too. So they do make mistakes that are a little bit more self-serving as well. I don't think there's any human on the planet that can rationalize doing that something is the right thing to do because it serves them than a middle schooler. They just can find the logic to make it work for themselves, whether they're ditching plans with somebody for better plans or anything that you can think of. And again, it doesn't come from not wanting to be a good person or not being a good person. It comes from all of that interference coupled with the developmental phase.
If you do see your child about to make a poor decision, like ditching plans for a better opportunity comes along or something like that, how do you find the balance between your own wisdom and judgment and experience and not controlling them?
So I don't want to give the impression that parents can't actually say what they think. And I think it's important to talk about your family's values. In our family, we value honesty, or we take it seriously when we make plans and we try to keep them, whatever that might be. But you might get farther if you start by asking something like, how do you think she'll feel? Or how would you feel if that happened to you? And a parent can even share a situation where that happened to them. I think we probably all have some anecdote from our lives where we felt ditched or not truly included. And just taking a minute for them to pause and think about it. So much of what's happening in their lives is related to the fact that it takes longer for signals to get from their amygdala, the fight, flight, or freeze part of their brain, to their prefrontal cortex, which is the front, more analytical, logical, self-compassionate, empathetic part of the brain. So simply pausing and asking them to consider it with a little bit more care sometimes can actually help them come up with a different answer than they might have initially. And if they aren't going to do what you think is the right thing to do anyway, you can at least help them think about ways that they might be able to soften the blow. Maybe they can reschedule for another night, or maybe they can deliver the message in a way that would be less hurtful. And maybe if they're ditching them for a party, they don't have to post about it on social media so that the other kid can see what they were left out of. So sometimes it's about mitigating the damage too.
Let's shift a little bit to talking about bullying. Maybe give us your definition, and then I have some questions for you about it.
Yeah. So often it will sound like bullying when your kids come home, but true bullying has 3 characteristics. It's the 3 Ps: purpose, pattern, and power. There's a power imbalance. So older, younger, more social capital, less social capital, a group of kids against one. There's an intent to wound. That's the purpose. And there's a pattern. It's not a one-time mean comment. It's something that's happening repeatedly, as opposed to meanness, which is 2 kids sort of on equal social footing who are saying unkind things to each other. And then I always talk about a third category, which I call emotional discomfort, which middle schoolers tend to categorize as meanness or bullying, when in fact it's just that they are having trouble sitting with the discomfort of a certain social situation. Could be walking into a cafeteria and people not beckoning them to come sit with them. It could be not getting invited to a party that you wanted to get invited to, but maybe you didn't invite that kid to your party either. So as parents, we can really listen to the details of the story and try to get a handle on whether it's bullying, meanness, or discomfort. Because if it's bullying, they need adult support. Very few kids can handle that on their own. If it's meanness, we want to be coaching them and helping them resolve it with their permission. I always like saying, do you want my help? Or do you just want me to listen? And then the emotional discomfort piece, if that's what you're hearing, then you can help them come up with ways to manage it. So if you have a kid who feels too socially awkward to, let's say, go to the cafeteria during lunch and they've been hiding in a bathroom, maybe you can help them come up with a plan where they bring something to read when they first get in there, or they make plans to meet somebody that they're comfortable with right outside the doors of the cafeteria before lunch. So I think it's important first to know what they're dealing with.
I love those distinctions. And yeah, I like the third category too, because systematic exclusion is different from just being like overlooked, is different from somebody who's everybody's whispering, don't talk to them or whatever.
Yeah.
But it can feel the same in some ways, just that horrible left out feeling. I have a membership for parents and we have office hours where people ask questions, and we had like a rolling 3-week conversation about this topic of bullying and how to make kids bully proof and what is bullying. And I'll just share a little bit of the context. One mom was talking about her 9-year-old who's a neurodivergent kiddo. And she said that he had been coming home saying that these kids were bullying him and she didn't think it was bullying. And then she explained to me what was happening. And basically everything he did or said or wore, there was this one kid that would make fun of him. He had this t-shirt that had a Hershey's kiss on it because they'd gone to Hershey, Pennsylvania. And the kid always called it his poop shirt. It definitely sounded to me like they weren't huge things, but it definitely to me sounded like he was being singled out by this one kid who could guarantee a laugh from everybody else at this one child's expense. How do you help your child in that situation where going to the teacher and saying he called my shirt a poop shirt is probably not necessarily going to be the best way to handle it? Or, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that is a way to handle it.
First of all, 3rd grade is like Lord of the Flies. I always say it's the 1st, 7th grade. Third grade usually for girls and 4th grade for boys, but that general vicinity, because there's all the drama and all the social jockeying and all the awareness of how you stack up to others without the empathy that comes later. And it's still developing in middle school too, but there's even less in 3rd grade. And then you add in that element of boys versus girls. And boys are more likely than girls to use humor to get a laugh or to show dominance or even to bond. And it's often misguided and it often doesn't land the way they intended. And they might be as surprised as the person who's hearing it that it's hurtful. So I wouldn't necessarily assume the kid who's making these comments is trying to wound him, but especially a neurodivergent child. And I was talking about this recently with Ryan Wetzelblatt, the ADHD. He's got a company called ADHD Dude. And he was talking about elementary school kids. And he was saying that boys who have the more inattentive profile, he tends to see as the stick collectors. They're the kids who are walking around the perimeter of the playground collecting the sticks. And kids who have a more impulsive profile tend to have a harder time distinguishing between threatening and non-threatening behavior. They're the ones who are quick to say they're being bullied or victimized, when in fact, other kids find them to be too much, or they might not want to play the game that they played. So if I were the parent of that child, I would be talking to the school, to the teacher, to people who are observing him at recess, and first trying to get a handle on what's happening. Sounds like both of them probably need some social skills help. There's an exercise as a school counselor I've always done with third and fourth graders in particular. I call it nice, mean, or in between. And we go through a whole list of statements, things like you got a haircut or we already have enough goalies. And I have kids role play them. And what they discover very quickly is that the same comment, the same exact comment can seem offensive or inoffensive depending on different factors like the tone, the words, whether or not somebody has a pre-existing trusting relationship with you or is someone who has teased you in the past. And so helping kids understand what is appropriate to joke about and what might be hurtful and how the same comment can feel different depending on who's delivering it. In the case of this boy, part of the reason it's so hard for this other child to hear it is because it's happening over and over again. There's no trust there. And so I would be getting the school involved for a situation like that, whether or not it's bullying, simply because it's a learning opportunity.
Is there a way that you can raise kids to be, I don't want to blame the victim, but do you see that there are certain kinds of kids that make them more targets of bullies? And is there a way as parents we can help our kids not be that target for a bully?
Yeah, I think some of it is the recognizing who your child is and recognizing that there are things they might be doing that are getting in their way. I've had plenty of kids, often they're boys, who are, I don't want to say easy marks, but in some ways they're easy marks because they are missing social cues or they're misinterpreting feedback or they are introducing the sour note into the conversation. They're the kid who everybody says the test is hard and they're like, I don't know, I thought it was easy. Or a kid who is only talking about baseball statistics, even if everybody else is talking about a concert they went to. And those kids do need extra social skills help. And they might need an evaluation. They might need help with a speech pathologist if they're not understanding language the way others are. Parents can help them understand. I think I share an anecdote in Middle School Superpowers from a speech pathologist who recommends saying things to your kid like, oh, the neighbor just told me that there are a lot of leaves, and then kind of scowled. And I think she was trying to tell me that it's time for me to clean up my yard so they don't blow into her yard. So it kind of goes back to those unwritten rules of socializing that some kids pick up on faster than others.
It still comes back to coaching them and teaching them the skills that they might not have.
And putting them in situations where they're likely to be successful and talking to the school too. They might be able to invite them to a lunch bunch, or there might even be a friendship group or something along those lines. I was talking to the educators over at Sterling Hall School, actually, which is, I think, near you. It's a boys' school, maybe in Toronto. And they have a program that they call a lunch with a mystery teacher. And kids can sign up to have lunch with a mystery teacher. And so if they're looking for that connection point, and sometimes the kids who struggle more with social skills are very, very good at talking to adults and who are more tolerant and have a harder time with middle schoolers. But in general, looking for opportunities to connect them with people that they will do well with and signaling to teachers that they're struggling, because teachers can set them up for success in the classroom. These scripts get written about kids' reputations, and teachers can actually inadvertently make it worse if they show their exasperation. So letting them know that they're struggling so the teacher can maybe praise them publicly or have them do something they know they'll do well can actually help that child's reputation improve.
In your book, you say maybe your instinct to depersonalize the mean behavior by focusing on an aggressor's low self-esteem or their sad backstory, it's more productive to focus on your child's strengths. Bullying is a form of gaslighting that manipulates kids into thinking something is wrong with them. And when they think they deserve to be mistreated, they're more likely to feel helpless, depressed, or paralyzed with anger. I think that if you look at conventional parenting where kids get punished and they get yelled at, and if you hadn't have done this, then I wouldn't be yelling at you right now. I wonder if that sets kids up to be a little bit more willing to put up with bad treatment of kids who are targeting them?
Yeah. I don't know any middle schooler or child period who does better because they think the stakes are high or because they think they're deficient in some way. Success begets success. So focusing on your child's strengths and leveraging those strengths to compensate for weaknesses is going to be more effective than telling them what's wrong with them. And it's actually win-win because when kids think that they're worthy of respect, as I said, they're not only less likely to be mean to someone else because they internalize this idea that everyone is worthy of respect, but they're less likely to tolerate mistreatment when it's directed at them.
Yeah, I love that. I see a lot of people saying, if you do peaceful parenting, how's your kid going to survive in the real world? And I think that in the real world, they'll know that they don't deserve to be treated this poorly because they were not treated poorly at home. Okay, last thing I want to ask you about. We sort of started talking about this a little bit in terms of how kids feel about themselves. And I know you said earlier, we can't make kids feel good about themselves, but at this age where self-esteem tends to plummet, are there things that we can do? One thing I know you mentioned was helping them avoid FOPO. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, and then anything else that you think that parents should know about raising kids who come through this time without feeling terrible about themselves.
Yeah, so the FOPO is fear of other people's opinions. And I think it's so hard to be a tween today because you're not only worrying about that person who elbowed you in the hall and wondering if they did it on purpose or not. You then go home at the end of the day and you're still on social media and you're seeing everybody else's curated lives and wondering why you weren't included. And it's harder to shore up a kid's self-confidence. And so there are a few different things you can do. One of them, and I mentioned this in relation to FOPO, is to have kids write a list, and it should fit on like a 1-by-1 index card of the 4 or 5 people who they know love them, cheer for them, care about them, whose opinions they respect, who want the best for them. And if they receive advice or criticism, and it comes from one of those 4 or 5 people, they should take it to heart. But if it comes from, their friend's older brother or the assistant soccer coach on their rec team, and it doesn't feel so good, they don't necessarily have to take it to heart. They can decide that it's noise and just move on. I think if you're taking in every piece of feedback from every source, from where it's originating, you're not going to feel very good about yourself. And so that's one way. Another way that parents can help is to, when they hear kids criticizing themselves, and kids can be relentlessly self-critical at this age, to challenge the way they're thinking just a little bit, not by saying, no, you're wrong, you're so cool, which isn't going to do anything, but to ask them to come up with 1 or 2 strengths in that perceived weakness. I actually did this in a class full of 5th graders last year. And I said, what do you think tweens are or some things that tweens are insecure about? And this one boy who was overweight and very brave said, I think sometimes kids are worried that they're too heavy or that they don't have the right body type. And so then I said to the class, can anyone think of something good about struggling with your weight or feeling like your weight isn't the same as everyone else's? And this one sweet girl, very earnest, raised her hand and she said, I can think of 2 things. And she said, number 1, I would know that person isn't going to be critical of me. And I'm really underweight and I worry about being underweight and I don't think they would criticize me. And 2, that would be the first person I want on my tug of war team, which was really sweet. And, just helping reframe the things that kids are worried about, take ADHD, since we've talked about it. Sometimes kids worry about being, criticized for being too loud or for interrupting a lot. And they also often are the most dynamic or the first person to take a risk in a classroom setting. So just helping kids expand whatever that supposed weakness is and seeing it in a broader light.
Yeah. And I take your point of we can't tell our kids things that they know are untrue, like you're so cool or something like that. But I do think that we can carry them through. I've interviewed a couple people on my podcast who were bullied as kids, and they said that it really was their parents' unconditional positive regard that really can carry kids through these hard years.
Yes, and I think it's fine to compliment your child. I would just caution that it needs to feel authentic.
Yes.
So find something very specific that you admire about them and share that
Well, and
with them.
just enjoy being with them and being in their
Yes.
presence and spending
Yeah,
time
and laugh
together and
together.
Mhm.
Exactly. There's a girl who I talk about in the book. It wasn't a bullying, well, it was sort of a bullying situation, but it was complicated by some mental health challenges. And one of the things that really resonated for me is that when she was really excluded and actually outright ostracized by just about everybody and was spending all of her time in her room by herself, she wasn't very nice to her parents at the time about it. But now that she's in high school, she so appreciates that her parents would come in, check on her, sit with her, and keep her company when no one else would hang out with her. So it may not seem like you're welcome in the moment, but they still very much appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Red flags for parents in terms of what's normal, middle school ups and downs versus when their child might need some outside help.
So I would say if any of the major activities of daily living are impacted. So they're eating a tremendous amount more or less, or they're sleeping a tremendous amount more or less, or they've completely ditched their friend group and they're online, maybe hanging out in chat groups with kids who've got a really dark outlook on life. Uh, Suddenly they're not interested in things that they used to be really interested in. If you notice any of those signs, or if they're self-harming and you can see signs of that, or they come to you and tell you that they are really having a hard time. One of the things that's hard in this age group is that we're unlikely to find out that kids are in trouble from them. Young adolescents are much less likely than older adolescents to ask for support, to even know that it's okay to ask for support. When they do ask for support, they tend to ask a peer rather than an adult. So we want to be having preemptive conversations with our kids before they're in crisis, where we're asking them, if you were having a really hard time, which adult would you talk to? And let them know it's okay if it's not you, but make sure they have somebody in mind.
I love that. I think you call them lighthouse adults
Yeah,
in the
that
book.
was based on and a different person that I interviewed in the book. And he was talking about his own childhood, and it was a really hard childhood. And he had a few adults in his life who were his lighthouses. One was a neighbor who, at a time when he was really neglected, would come over and bring him books to read, which gave him a vision of a world beyond his own life. So yeah, we can be that for kids' friends as well, especially if they don't have an equivalent person in
So
their life.
important. What did you see in terms of how COVID affected this age group? And do you think that kids are bouncing back?
Yeah, I think kids who missed sort of those 3rd through 5th grade years, those Lord of the Flies years that I was talking about, I think they are behind socially in particular. They also have a harder time self-regulating and self-soothing. There's research showing that kids have less core strength. So sitting in a chair all day is harder. And we're going to see that lag for a while. That doesn't mean they're not doing fine, all things considered, but we need to factor in the fact that they had this prolonged distancing from peers and that they were impacted by the stress all the adults around them experienced. So things are trending in the right direction for kids, but we see those lingering effects. And then I would say that adults are still stressed and still recovering from that period too, and kids. And so just a reminder to parents to take care of themselves and tend to their own needs so they can be there for their kids in a really healthy way. And it's okay for adults too to need therapy or to need support from their peers in a different way and to model that for their kids.
Thanks for that. This is a question I ask all my podcast guests. If you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
That the range of normal is so broad that it is really hard. I think it's really hard for parents, especially when kids are babies and toddlers. Everything seems to be happening in lockstep. You sign up for the same mommy group or the same music class or the preschool that your friend's sending their kid to preschool. And then suddenly kids start to diverge a little bit. They have different interests, and it can be disconcerting to realize that your kid doesn't want to play soccer like the other kids, or maybe your kid needs OT or speech or whatever it is that's going on in their life. And what I would go back and tell myself is that it's okay. Everybody's on their own timeline and their own track. To quote the author of Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, I share in the book her graduation speech at my daughter's high school graduation. One of the things she talks about it is first she said, there's no right track. And then she said, there's no track. And I think that's something I would go back and tell myself, there's no track. Everybody just moves at their own pace. And I was not a school counselor when my first child was born. That was a career change for me. And one of the gifts of being a school counselor in my own life is that I see every day that there are so many different ways to be a child, to be a teen, and that it's all okay. And that there's no one right social group. And the kids who seem to have it all together don't have it all together. And the kids who only have a couple of friends might be super happy and doing just fine. So being really careful not to impose our own assumptions on our kids.
Thanks. That is so valuable. Where can folks go to find out more about what you and what you do? Best place to send them. And also before we started recording, you mentioned an app that you have been developing and that you were going to tell us about that.
Yeah, the app is a voice-activated self-coaching app for teens so that they can choose an issue that's relevant to them and talk through it. And I created it with a man named Dave Keeler because we realized kids don't want to do workbook activities. And so many parents were asking me if there was a kid equivalent of the books I'm writing for parents. And if you send an email to service@congruence.app with the name of this podcast, we'll send out a link for a free full month of premium access to the app.
We'll put a link to that. We'll put that email address in the show notes, and then just put the Peaceful Parenting Podcast in the subject line and say you'd like to get the month for free. Thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. And then my books, Middle School Matters and Middle School Superpowers, are available anywhere. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, I have a website, phyllisfagell.com, and on social media, my handle is @pfagell.
Okay, we'll put all those in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.